We must avenge our martyred saints. This was the declaration of Eugénie de Montijo, the Empress of France, upon hearing the news of the execution of French and Spanish bishops in Vietnam. And what happened next? The French took revenge by colonizing Vietnam for nearly a century. But why Vietnam? Was it solely for religious reasons? This is Hoi An, which, in the 16th century, was one of the most bustling commercial ports in Southeast Asia. At that time, through merchant ships and missionaries, many Western countries had already taken an interest in Vietnam. Let's listen to what a French priest and merchant named Pierre Poivre, who visited Dang Trong in 1748 to 1749, had to say. We must take control of the two ports of Hua Han and Hoi An. Force is the only means that must be applied. And that is precisely the issue. Now, imagine waking up one morning to find yourself a Nguyen dynasty emperor in the first half of the 19th century. You open your doors and see Western powers invading everywhere around you, from India and China to Singapore and Indonesia. Looking out to sea, you see Western ships constantly demanding trade access and freedom of religion. This was why the Nguyen emperors sought to minimize contact between Dai Nam and Western countries. Meanwhile, these nations, especially France, persistently attempted to establish relations with the Nguyen court. But in the end, the Nguyen rulers' answer remained, no. As a result, French naval officers in the Far East began proposing military intervention in Vietnam. However, at the time, the French foreign minister, François Guizot, did not support the idea. Guizot believed that France needed an alliance with Britain to restore its great power status in Europe. For this reason, he did not want to antagonize the British by expanding France's influence in Asia. However, in 1844, as the Opium War in China escalated, the French also gained access to this lucrative market. Thus, Guizot tasked General Cecile with finding a French base in the Far East, one similar to Britain's Singapore, Portugal's Macau, or the Netherlands' Indonesia. That said, Guizot's orders remained clear: to avoid conflict with Britain, Cecile was not to touch Vietnam. However, Spain, which was occupying the Philippines at the time, fiercely opposed the move. They argued that Basilan was part of the Philippines, forcing the French to withdraw. Meanwhile, French missionaries in Vietnam had their own plans. They promised that France would secure a naval base in Vietnam, if they helped restore the Le dynasty. Seizing this opportunity, Admiral Cecile urged intervention in Vietnam. But once again, Guizot refused. His reason? The same as before, he did not want to risk upsetting Britain. This decision outraged French officers and missionaries in the Far East. To them, it was as if Paris had simply abandoned them. One furious missionary even compared France's actions to a dog that only barks from a distance but never dares to bite. And as if that wasn't enough, tensions in France began to boil over. Reports of Vietnamese persecution against Catholic converts spread like wildfire, fueling public outrage. The situation was complex, far too intricate to fully explore in this video, but one thing was certain: the storm was coming. Back in France, in 1852, a man ascended the throne, backed by conservative factions, particularly the Catholic Party. His name? Napoleon III. Napoleon III understood that he had a duty. A duty he could not ignore, to protect the suffering Catholics in China and Vietnam. But was that his only reason? Of course not. Every invasion is an act of aggression. But to justify war, one always needs a righteous cause. And right now, nothing served that purpose better than religion. More importantly, Vietnam was a prize, a gateway to wealth and power for France's colonial ambitions. And so, the calls to attack Dai Nam grew louder. Three powerful forces pushed for war. First, the French naval officers stationed in Chinese waters. They needed a stronghold in the Far East. A base where their fleet could dock, repair, resupply, and take shelter from storms. Vietnam, with its long coastline, had plenty of ideal locations. Second, the French diplomats in China. Men like Alphonse de Bourboulon had long urged France to seize Korea and Vietnam, believing expansion was key to securing French influence in Asia. And third, the Catholic missionaries. Figures like Huc, Le Grand de la Lyre, and Pellerin. Among them, Huc had never even set foot in Vietnam. But did that stop him from demanding military intervention? Not at all. Even before 1857, Huc had been urging Napoleon III to take Korea, Madagascar, and Da Nang. Then, in January 1857, he sent yet another proposal. He claimed that France had an undeniable right to intervene under the 1787 treaty, despite the fact that France had never actually honored it. But to Huc, Vietnam was an easy target. After all, France had the military might to take whatever it wanted. So why not seize it? A gentle, hard-working nation, perfect for spreading the faith of God, is now groaning under a monstrous despotism. This nation will welcome us as liberators, as benefactors. In just a short time, we can completely turn them into devoted Catholics and loyal subjects of France. Meanwhile, Le Grand de la Lyre argued. Politically, seizing Vietnam would limit the influence of the British in the Far East, the Spanish in the Philippines, and the Dutch in Indonesia. Economically, Vietnam was a fertile, wealthy colony, even richer than Java and Borneo. Its people were intelligent and industrious. Militarily, Vietnam was an easy conquest. The government was corrupt and tyrannical, the people longed for the return of the Le dynasty, the king was debauched, lost in wine and pleasure, while officials were divided into factions, fighting for power. The navy had been crippled since the French attack in 1847. The army lacked modern weapons, had poor combat skills, and its fortresses were dilapidated. Troop numbers were insufficient. According to Lyre, Vietnam was like a fruit overly ripe, yet not fallen. He warned, "Lord, do not let it fall into British hands." Lyre even proposed a detailed attack plan, starting with diplomacy. First, France would send a delegation bearing gifts to the Nguyen court, persuading them to allow French officers in Phu Quoc, Cam Ranh, Da Nang, and Qua Cam to ensure free trade, missionary work, and residence for foreign priests. Grant France permanent control over Da Nang, Hoi An, and Su Lao Cham, making them naval bases, supply depots, and shelters for French ships. Establish a mutual defense and attack alliance. But Lyre himself doubted that diplomacy would succeed. So he had already planned for a military intervention. If the Nguyen court refused these conditions, France would protect Vietnam. If they resisted further, France would launch simultaneous assaults on Bac Khai, Hue, and Da Nang, overthrow the Nguyen dynasty, and install a puppet Le dynasty king in Hanoi. France could afford to be aggressive, Lyre argued, because if Vietnam rejected such reasonable conditions, it would make itself a criminal in the eyes of the world for shamelessly severing ties with an ally nation. Lyre even devised a highly detailed military plan, including specific estimates of warships and troops needed for the invasion. And so, in the end, he chose to go, volunteering as an interpreter for the expeditionary force. The third man in this unfolding drama was Bishop Pellerin, a victim of Vietnam's relentless crackdown on Christianity. By May 1857, he had already made his way back to France, determined to push for armed intervention. And push he did. His fiery appeals roused the press, stirred public outrage, and even reached the ears of Empress Eugénie de Montijo, a devout Catholic with a personal connection to one of the executed missionaries. Soon, it seemed that all of France wanted war, even Napoleon III's own wife. Beyond France's borders, the moment was ripe. In India, the British were drowning in a sea of rebellion, their forces stretched thin, too consumed by their own crisis to care about what France was planning in Vietnam. In China, the fall of Guangzhou in December 1857 had led to the reinforcement of the French fleet in the Far East, 8 new warships, ready to strike. And in Vietnam itself, Emperor Tu Duc had just signed the death warrant of Spanish Bishop Diaz, to be carried out on July 20, 1857. That single act gave France all the justification it needed to pull Spain into the fight. As luck would have it, Spanish troops were already stationed in the Philippines, waiting. But the truth was, Napoleon III had already made up his mind. This war was happening. These convenient circumstances only reinforced his decision. And so, the Commission de la Cochinchine was assembled, a panel of men tasked with putting the final seal on what had already been decided. From April 28 to May 18, 1857, under the leadership of Viscount Brenier, they met, deliberated, and, in their last session, laid out the key justifications: the defense of faith, the assertion of political power, and, of course, the promise of new commercial opportunities. The wheels were in motion. And Vietnam would soon feel the weight of France's ambitions. For 50 years, our missionaries and faithful followers have endured unspeakable suffering. 60,000 lives have been lost, persecuted, tortured, and executed. And are we to sit idly by, watching from a distance as this horror unfolds? When Britain has already wielded its arms in defense of religion and civilization in China, how can we justify inaction in Vietnam? Political interests are the engine that drives all great nations, pushing the West ever eastward. And yet, can it be that we, alone, have no stake in this land? While Britain, the Netherlands, Spain, and even Russia have all established themselves in the region, shall France stand empty-handed? The commercial opportunities are as clear as day. Vietnam offers cotton, silk, sugar, and rice in abundance. Its forests are rich with timber, ripe for construction, and coffee plants grow wild along garden fences. France must claim its rightful place. Britain has China, the richer prize, the grander feast. But Vietnam? Vietnam must belong to France. There is no room for debate. Our position relative to Britain is clear. The English have no claim to Vietnam, while we have a long-standing tradition here. They have secured their interests in China, and we shall secure ours in Vietnam. We can, and we must, act independently. Religious interests and national interests are one and the same. For the honor of France, they cannot be separated. We are the only ones who have demonstrated true force in this land, and to ensure success, our conquest must be swift, secret, and executed without delay. The time to act is now. This conquest would be justified by the recent losses we have suffered and the urgent need to put an end to religious persecution. With this rationale, the proposal was presented to the Emperor of France. Napoleon III made his decision: he would launch the expedition. The orders were sent to Admiral Rigaud de Genlis, then serving as the commander of French forces fighting alongside the British in Guangdong, China. There was no expectation of success through negotiation. Any attempt to reopen diplomatic discussions was deemed futile. Upon arrival, the admiral was to seize Da Nang's Bay and surrounding territory without delay. Once secured, he would then assess the next course of action: should France establish a lasting protectorate over Vietnam, or should it settle for a treaty, one of commerce, friendship, and maritime agreements? Any resolution must ensure clear and firm guarantees to prevent future persecution of our missionaries. The Emperor fully endorsed this strategy, leaving the final decision to Admiral Rigaud de Genlis' judgment and military discretion. This directive made one thing clear: Napoleon III had no real interest in diplomatic solutions. The plan was military conquest, swift and decisive. With the signing of the Treaty of Tientsin in China in June 1858, Admiral Rigaud de Genlis was free to turn his attention to Vietnam. By late August, from the port of Yulikan, at the southern tip of Hainan Island, the French warships set sail. Their destination, the Bay of Da Nang. Their mission, invasion.